I never thought that one social media post could make me the bad guy in my own family overnight. My name is Natasha. I am 31 years old, and everything changed when my sister wrote about me online. She said I left the family when they needed me most. The words were written so strongly that the story seemed already finished. What hurt more than what she said was seeing my parents quietly like the post. Their silence made it seem like they agreed with a story I was never part of. I read everything without writing back. I watched as blame was pushed away from where it should be. I watched years of hard work turned into just a few sentences. I did not comment or explain because I knew that once something is posted online, it stops being about what is true and becomes about who has control. Instead of fighting online, I collected every text message and every money record from our shared responsibilities. Then I sent them straight to my lawyer. Things got worse quickly after that. The accusations kept spreading. My silence was used against me, and pressure started building in ways I could not ignore. Everything really exploded when my father called me over and over in a panic. He left worried messages, asking why the bank account was frozen. I chose not to answer. Just 2 days later, my family got a letter from the court. It made clear this was no longer just a family argument. If this happened to you, would you try to save the relationship or protect yourself first? I am curious to hear your answer. The problems that came up later did not appear from nowhere. They grew quietly inside a family that had always worked unfairly. In my family, big decisions were rarely talked about openly. They were announced after being made, often explained as necessary or practical. This left little room for disagreement. What looked like peace from the outside was mostly people going along with things. This happened over time through habits that stopped people from asking questions instead of encouraging fairness. I grew up understanding that certain voices mattered more, even when no one said it out loud. My sister Megan was always positioned closer to those decisions, not because she demanded it, but because the system naturally bent toward her. My father and my mother kept that system going without fighting. They chose keeping things the same over conflict. This meant the same patterns repeated year after year. No one ever sat us down to explain roles, but everyone seemed to know where they stood. As I became an adult, responsibility followed me more than recognition did. I handled practical matters that needed steady attention. This ranged from organizing family plans to stepping in when money became tight. Financial support was never called an obligation, but it became expected, assumed, quietly folded into how we interacted. I did not volunteer to become the safety net, but I became one simply by not refusing when help was needed. The unfairness did not show itself through harsh words or direct orders. It appeared through repeated choices that always went the same way. When plans conflicted, mine were changed first. When disagreements came up, mine were postponed. When explanations were needed, I was expected to give them, while others were given the benefit of the doubt. Over time, these small moments formed a clear pattern that did not need to be spoken to be understood. Mom and Dad avoided open fights whenever tension appeared. They often chose silence as a temporary solution that slowly became permanent. When problems came up, they preferred to wait them out. They believed time would soften everything, even when nothing actually changed. That approach created an environment where problems never disappeared. They simply settled underneath the surface, growing heavier each time they were ignored. Silence became the automatic response, not because it fixed anything, but because it felt easier in the moment. I tried for years to help constructively, to raise concerns calmly, to explain how certain expectations affected me. Each attempt ended the same way. I got vague promises that things would balance out eventually, followed by no real change. Conversations drifted away from specifics and landed in generalities. This left me feeling that being heard was conditional rather than guaranteed. The more I explained, the less impact my words seemed to have. Eventually, I began pulling back. Not out of anger, but out of clarity. I stopped offering immediate solutions to problems that were never shared equally. I limited my involvement in discussions where decisions had already been made before I entered the room. This withdrawal was gradual, almost unnoticeable at first, but it marked a big internal shift. I was no longer trying to prove my value because I realized value should not require constant defense. That distance created discomfort, though not in the way I expected. Instead of causing reflection, it was seen as detachment, even disloyalty. The assumption that I would always step in had been so deeply built in that my absence felt disruptive rather than understandable. What no one acknowledged was that stepping back was the only way I could keep any sense of balance for myself. By the time conflict became visible to others, the foundation had already been unstable for a long time. What followed later was not a sudden betrayal, but the result of years of unspoken expectations colliding with boundaries that were finally taking shape. The unfairness did not begin with accusations. It began with silence that lasted far too long. That morning, I realized my story was being told in a way I could not control. I opened my phone expecting routine updates, only to find that Megan had already shaped a public version of events. In her version, I was the person who walked away when the family was struggling. The post was written carefully, not aggressively, but with a tone that invited sympathy and agreement. It left very little room for questions or context. She framed the situation as simple and clear. She presented herself as someone holding things together while I chose distance. There were no details about what led up to that moment, no mention of shared responsibilities or long-standing arrangements. Just a story that guided readers toward a single conclusion. By avoiding specifics, the story became easier to accept because it asked for emotion rather than understanding. Attached to the post was a family photo, one that carried more weight than any paragraph could. It showed everyone together, smiling and looking happy. But my absence was impossible to ignore. The image worked as silent proof, suggesting unity on one side and abandonment on the other. It was not an accident that I was missing from that picture, and the message it sent did not need explanation. People respond to pictures faster than words, and that image did most of the work for her. The reaction came quickly. Comments appeared from people who had never spoken to me directly. They expressed disappointment and concern based entirely on what they had just read. Some offered advice, others passed judgment, all without hesitation. The post was shared beyond its original audience, gaining momentum as it moved through circles that knew nothing about the history behind it. Each interaction pushed the story further from me, strengthening an impression I had no part in creating. What confirmed the direction this was taking was seeing Mom and Dad interact with the post. Their approval was quiet but unmistakable, a simple gesture that signaled alignment without explanation. It told anyone watching which side they believed, or at least which side they were willing to support publicly. That reaction carried more impact than any comment because it removed doubt about where the family stood. I did not rush to respond. I understood how quickly online exchanges escalate, how explanations turn into arguments, and how arguments get reduced to sound bites. Any attempt to clarify would have required more space than a comment box allows, and even then it would have been filtered through assumptions already in place. Responding publicly would not correct the story. It would only keep it alive. As the post continued to spread, I watched the gap widen between what was being said and what I knew was reality. Silence began to work against me, but speaking up would have handed control back to the platform rather than addressing the situation itself. I chose not to participate in a conversation that rewarded simplification over truth, even though that choice came with consequences. The most unsettling part was how quickly perception replaced familiarity. People who had known me for years accepted the version presented to them without reaching out. They trusted the structure of the story more than their own experience. That shift revealed how fragile personal understanding can be once it is challenged publicly. The post did not just question my actions. It redefined my role within the family in front of an audience. I stayed offline while the discussion continued, aware that every hour increased the distance between me and the story forming around my name. The situation had crossed a line where private resolution was no longer possible. But public defense would have only deepened the divide. At that point, restraint felt like the only option that did not compromise my position further. By the end of that morning, it was clear that the conflict had moved into a space governed by visibility rather than facts. What began as a single post had already reshaped relationships, expectations, and assumptions, setting the stage for consequences that would not stay confined to social media. 24 hours after that post, I understood that silence did not mean standing still. I spent the morning going through everything I had avoided for years, not out of denial, but because I believed family problems should stay contained. I opened old message threads, reread emails that once felt routine, and lined them up beside financial records tied to shared responsibilities. What I saw was not chaos or confusion, but a clear pattern of expectation placed on me without discussion, followed by selective memory when those expectations became inconvenient. Each document added weight to the realization that this situation had been forming long before it appeared online. I did not start this process with anger. I approached it the same way I had handled family matters before, methodically and without drama. The difference was that this time I was not trying to fix anything internally. I was trying to understand my exposure. Once a story leaves the private space of a family, it enters a system that does not care about intentions, only records and consequences. That was when I accepted that protecting myself required a different kind of response. That afternoon, I contacted my lawyer, Jennifer, and explained what had happened. I described the public accusations, the selective framing, and the way silence was being interpreted as guilt. Jennifer listened without interrupting, then asked questions that shifted my perspective immediately. She was not interested in who felt wronged or who started the conflict. She focused on how the situation could evolve if left unaddressed, especially when financial entanglements were involved. Jennifer explained that allowing a public version of events to stand uncontested could carry risks beyond reputation. When shared accounts and past agreements are part of the story, distorted narratives can influence future disputes, even if they begin online. She warned that waiting too long could limit my options, not because I was wrong, but because inaction often gets interpreted as acceptance. Her advice was not aggressive or punitive. It was preventative. That conversation forced me to confront something I had avoided, admitting the boundary between family and accountability had already been crossed the moment private matters were broadcast to an audience. At that point, the issue was no longer emotional misunderstanding. It was exposure. Once I saw it that way, my hesitation faded. I was not betraying anyone by seeking protection. I was responding to a situation that had changed shape without my consent. We discussed next steps carefully. There was no talk of revenge or public correction. Jennifer outlined options that focused on documentation, clarification of financial roles, and formal separation of responsibilities where needed. Each step was designed to reduce risk rather than escalate conflict. I agreed to proceed slowly, understanding that measured action carried more weight than reactive statements. As I gathered what Jennifer requested, I noticed how often I had been the default solution without being the decision-maker. Bills paid, issues handled, arrangements maintained, all without acknowledgement until something went wrong. Seeing those contributions, documented, stripped them of emotional distortion. On paper, responsibility becomes visible in ways memory can no longer rewrite. I also accepted that these steps would likely change how my family viewed me. Choosing legal structure over informal trust sends a message, even when that message is simply that boundaries matter. I knew some would interpret my actions as cold or calculated, ignoring the fact that the situation itself had already moved into a space where warmth no longer protected anyone. That possibility weighed on me, but it did not stop me. What surprised me most was the sense of calm that followed. Making decisions grounded in clarity removed the constant mental negotiation I had lived with for years. I no longer needed to anticipate reactions or prepare explanations. I was responding to facts, not accusations. That shift did not bring relief, but it brought stability, which felt more valuable. By the end of that day, the path forward was set, even if its outcome was uncertain. I understood that family ties do not dissolve instantly, but trust can break quietly once boundaries are ignored. Whatever came next would not be resolved through conversation alone. It would unfold through processes designed to handle exactly what had happened when private obligations became public leverage. I did not know how my family would respond when they realized I had stopped absorbing the weight silently. I only knew that remaining unprotected was no longer an option, and that recognition marked a point I could not return from. A few days later, what I had prepared began to create real consequences. The legal steps moved forward quietly, exactly as Jennifer had explained they would. There were no announcements, no confrontations, and no warnings sent through family channels. The process followed standard procedure, focused on clarification and protection rather than punishment. As a result, the shared financial account was temporarily frozen while its structure and obligations were reviewed. It was not a dramatic action, but it was firm, and it immediately disrupted routines that had long relied on access without question. I learned about the reaction not through official notices, but through the sudden shift in tone online. Megan posted again, this time with urgency layered over anger. The new post framed recent events as an attack rather than a consequence, casting herself as someone blindsided by cruelty she claimed she did not deserve. She did not mention legal procedures or shared responsibilities, only the inconvenience and stress caused by what she described as unnecessary interference. Several lines in her post were designed to provoke outrage. She wrote about betrayal without context, about being punished for speaking up, about how silence from certain people proved a lack of empathy. The language avoided specifics while amplifying emotion, encouraging readers to fill in gaps with assumptions. Responsibility was redirected outward, away from decisions that had led to this point and toward a single unnamed source that everyone already believed they recognized. This time the response did not unfold the same way. Questions appeared alongside sympathy. Some people asked what had actually happened with the account, why access had changed so suddenly, and whether there was more to the story than what was being shared. The narrative began to strain under its own simplicity. Instead of isolating me further, the pressure started to press back toward the center of the family dynamic. Messages circulated privately as well. Relatives who had stayed silent earlier began reaching out to one another, comparing notes rather than reacting publicly. The issue was no longer framed as abandonment, but as instability caused by unresolved arrangements. The shift was subtle but noticeable, and it changed how the situation was discussed both online and off. That afternoon, Dad called me. His voice was unsteady, edged with panic rather than accusation. He demanded to know why the account was frozen, why access had been cut without warning, and what I thought I was doing. The call was not a request for explanation, but a demand for immediate reversal, rooted in the assumption that I still held responsibility without authority. I did not answer. I listened to the voicemail afterward, then set the phone down. Responding in that moment would not have clarified anything. It would have pulled me back into an emotional exchange while the matter was already being addressed through formal channels. I understood that engaging directly would only blur boundaries that had finally been defined. The silence unsettled them more than any argument could have. Without a direct response, they were forced to confront the process itself rather than negotiate around it. The situation was no longer something that could be managed through pressure or persuasion. It had entered a space governed by documentation, timelines, and accountability. As the hours passed, the online conversation continued to shift. Megan's second attempt to control the narrative lost momentum as attention moved away from accusation and toward consequence. The lack of a clear villain complicated the story she was trying to maintain. What remained was discomfort, confusion, and a growing awareness that the issue could not be reduced to a single post. I stayed focused on what I could control. The steps I had taken were not designed to embarrass anyone or escalate conflict. They existed to protect my position after boundaries had been ignored. Watching the fallout unfold confirmed what I had already accepted. Once family matters become public leverage, the resolution no longer belongs to feelings alone. By the end of that period, it was clear that the balance had shifted. The same public space that had once amplified blame was now exposing instability. What began as an attempt to assign fault had triggered a process that demanded clarity instead. The consequences were unfolding in real time, no longer contained by narrative and no longer directed solely at me. 2 days later, my family stopped trying to reach me by phone. The shift was immediate and unmistakable. The unanswered calls, the unreturned messages, the sudden silence were not signs of restraint or reflection. They were signs of something else entering the situation, something that did not respond to emotion, pressure, or familiarity. That morning, official letters were delivered to my parents' address, addressed formally and without room for interpretation. The matter was no longer framed as a disagreement or a misunderstanding. It was presented as a legal issue tied to financial responsibility, documentation, and compliance. I did not witness their reactions firsthand, but the sequence became clear through what followed. The initial confusion turned quickly into alarm. Questions that had once been framed as accusations now became frantic attempts to understand consequences. The language shifted from certainty to uncertainty, from moral judgment to legal concern. What had been dismissed as unnecessary escalation suddenly demanded attention because it carried timelines, obligations, and potential outcomes. Meghan lost control of the narrative almost immediately. Her previous confidence online vanished when the story could no longer be shaped by selective detail or emotional framing. There were no new posts explaining the situation, no attempts to rally sympathy, no carefully worded updates positioning herself as wronged. Silence replaced outrage, not because the conflict had resolved, but because the platform that once amplified her voice offered no protection from legal scrutiny. Inside, the family dynamics began to fracture under pressure. My parents could no longer avoid their involvement by remaining passive. The letter made clear that responsibility was shared, that decisions made over time carried weight, and that silence did not exempt anyone from accountability. The assumption that issues could be managed informally collapsed under the presence of formal language and documented expectations. Indirect attempts to reach me began almost immediately. Messages came through distant relatives, mutual acquaintances, and people who had never before involved themselves in family matters. The tone of these communications varied, but the intent was consistent. They were requests for mediation, for explanation, for reassurance that things could still be handled quietly. None of them addressed the substance of what was unfolding. They focused instead on discomfort, reputation, and the desire to return to a state where consequences felt negotiable. I did not respond to any of them. Silence was no longer an emotional reaction. It was a deliberate choice to allow the process to move forward without interference. Every attempt to draw me back into conversation carried the same underlying assumption that I would eventually step in to stabilize the situation, to absorb pressure, to make things easier for everyone else. That assumption no longer applied. The fear that followed was different from what had come before. It was not rooted in public perception or personal grievance. It came from the realization that there were now external standards to meet, standards that did not bend to familiarity or family history. My parents were forced to confront the reality that avoidance had allowed issues to accumulate rather than disappear. Meghan was confronted with the limits of narrative control when facts replaced interpretation. Through it all, I stayed removed. I continued to work through the proper channels, responding only where required and only in the ways advised. The distance was not an act of punishment. It was the only way to prevent the situation from reverting to emotional bargaining. Every step taken followed established procedures, documented communication, and defined timelines. What unsettled them most was not the content of the letter, but what it represented. The situation had crossed a threshold. It could no longer be softened by explanation or redirected through pressure. It required engagement with consequences rather than avoidance of them. That shift altered the balance completely. By the end of that period, the roles within my family had changed in ways that could not be undone. Authority, based on assumption, gave way to accountability, based on record. The silence they had once used as a shield now worked against them. The absence of my voice removed the option of negotiation through emotion. I understood then that the conflict had moved beyond personal hurt. It had entered a space where responsibility mattered more than intention. My decision to remain silent was not about distance. It was about allowing a system designed to address imbalance to function without distortion. The process continued, steady and indifferent to how the story had once been told. A few weeks later, no one was arguing about who was right or wrong anymore. By then, the situation had moved past opinions, emotions, and public narratives. What remained were documented outcomes and consequences that could not be reframed or softened. The court's findings were clear, measured, and grounded entirely in records that had existed long before the conflict became public. Meghan was held legally responsible for specific actions related to shared financial obligations, including misrepresentation and failure to meet agreed responsibilities. The ruling did not dramatize her behavior, but it removed any confusion about accountability. Financial penalties were imposed along with formal requirements to correct outstanding obligations that had been ignored or shifted onto others for years. My parents were not exempt from the outcome. Their long-standing pattern of avoidance and passive approval carried legal weight once examined through documentation. Decisions they had supported without oversight were now recognized as contributing rather than incidental. While the consequences they faced were not identical to Meghan's, they were significant enough to dismantle the assumption that silence equaled neutrality. Responsibility, once formalized, no longer allowed space for emotional justification or family hierarchy. Outside the courtroom, the impact spread quickly. The family's reputation within the community shifted in ways that could not be contained. Conversations that had once taken place privately now occurred without discretion. The same people who had shared Megan's posts earlier began to withdraw or redirect their attention, not out of loyalty, but from discomfort with facts that no longer aligned with the simplified narrative they had accepted. What had been framed as a personal conflict revealed itself as a pattern of conduct with real consequences, and the distinction mattered. Apologies arrived soon after, though they differed sharply from accountability. Messages spoke of regret, misunderstanding, and exhaustion, but avoided addressing the core issues that led to the legal outcome. There were no concrete plans, no acknowledgement of the imbalance that had existed for years, and no proposals that suggested lasting change. The words appeared motivated by loss of control rather than understanding. They arrived too late to serve as repair and too hollow to function as resolution. I read everything without responding. By that point, my decision no longer depended on explanations or reassurances. It rested on boundaries that had already been crossed too many times to renegotiate. The legal process had clarified something I had struggled to put into words for years. Protection was not an act of aggression. Distance was not punishment. They were necessary responses to repeated disregard for my role, my contributions, and my autonomy. I made my final decision quietly and without announcement. All remaining channels of contact were closed in a way that left no confusion. There was no confrontation, no final conversation, and no attempt to negotiate emotional closure. I understood that reconciliation requires mutual responsibility, not shared history alone. Without that foundation, continued contact would only recreate the same conditions under a different pretense. Cutting ties was not an impulsive choice. It followed weeks of observation, legal clarity, and internal acceptance that the relationships I had tried to preserve no longer existed in a form that allowed safety or respect. The absence that followed was not chaotic. It was structured, intentional, and necessary. For the first time, my decisions were not shaped by fear of backlash or obligation, but by a clear understanding of what I needed to remain whole. In the end, the conflict resolved itself without debate. The law addressed what emotions had distorted. The outcomes stood independent of personal interpretation. What remained for me was not bitterness or triumph, but a steady sense of finality. I stepped forward without leaving a door open behind me. Not because forgiveness was impossible, but because the cost of reopening that door was no longer acceptable. Life did not transform overnight after everything ended, but it became quieter in ways I had never experienced before. The absence of constant tension created space for routines that belonged only to me. I rebuilt my days around stability rather than reaction, choosing environments where my presence was not questioned or negotiated. There were moments of grief for what could have been different, but those moments no longer controlled my decisions. Distance gave clarity, and clarity brought a sense of safety I had underestimated for years. I began focusing on work that felt grounded, friendships that did not demand explanation, and habits that supported long-term balance instead of emotional survival. The silence that once felt heavy became structured and intentional. It allowed me to recognize how much energy had been spent managing other people's expectations while ignoring my own limits. This new life was not defined by revenge or victory, but by consistency and self-respect. For the first time, my choices were not shaped by fear of conflict or guilt disguised as responsibility. What this experience taught me is simple but difficult to accept. Boundaries only matter when they are enforced, not when they are explained repeatedly. Responsibility cannot be transferred through silence or rewritten through public narratives without consequences. When truth is distorted for comfort or control, it eventually demands accountability in ways no one expects. Protecting yourself is not abandonment, and stepping away does not erase the past. It acknowledges reality and accepts the cost of clarity. Thank you for staying with this story until the very end. Your time, attention, and willingness to listen mean more than quiet support ever could. Stories like this are rarely easy to share, but they matter because they reflect situations many people face privately. If you feel comfortable, I would truly appreciate hearing your thoughts. How would you have handled this situation, and what boundaries have you learned to protect in your own life? Please share your perspective or experience in the comments.